Hi, welcome to theAnalysis.news. I'm Paul J. We'll be back in just a few seconds to talk with Boris Kargalitsky about the coming climate crisis and how that impacts the war in Ukraine and the general political situation with Russia. Please don't forget, there's a donate button on the website. And if you're watching somewhere else, a podcast or YouTube or Substack or one of the various platforms, come on over to the website, get onto our email list. And if you'd like to support what we are doing, click the donate button. Be back in just a few seconds. As heat waves savage much of Europe, Russia has not yet been hit by such extreme temperatures this summer, but the overall trend in Russia is perhaps even more threatening. Over the last 100 years, the warming in Russia has been around 1.29 degrees Celsius, while warming on the global scale has been 0.74 degrees, according to the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report, showing that the warming of the Russian climate is happening at a faster rate than average. The UN Weather Agency said that it has certified a 38 degrees centigrade, that's 100.4 Fahrenheit reading in the Russian town of Verkhoyansk in 2020 as the highest temperature ever recorded in the Arctic, the latest in a string of alarm bells about our changing climate, they said. The World Meteorological Organization said the temperature, quote, more befitting the Mediterranean than the Arctic, which registered on that day, June 20th, 2020, during a heat wave that swept across Siberia and stretched across the Arctic Circle. Permafrost, which covers nearly 2/3 of Russian territory, is rapidly thawing. More dramatic freeze-thaw cycles in the subsoil are eroding urban infrastructure in Russia's Arctic cities, home to over 2 million people, and pose a mounting risk to Russia's 200,000 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines, not to mention thousands of miles of roads and rail lines bridging Russia's widest rivers. Oil and gas revenues make up around 40% of Russian government revenues, and by some reckoning, as much as 57% of the Russian GDP depends directly or indirectly on oil exports. So climate change and dependency on oil and gas are two fast-moving trains on their way to a head-on collision for the Russian economy. All this an existential threat to Russia before the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, this threat applies to the entire world economy, including the United States, which may have a more diversified economy than Russia, but is facing every bit as much a climate disaster, with heat waves, fires, floods, and extreme weather soon reaching catastrophic proportions. If ever there was a time when Russia, China, and the United States needed to cooperate on climate, it's now. Since Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and American and European determination to use this as an opportunity to weaken Putin, no matter how many Ukrainian lives are lost in the process, cooperation on the climate crisis is even more remote. Combine that with increased threat of nuclear war, more pandemics and famine in much of the world, global capitalism is in deep, deep crisis, even though massive wealth continues to flow into the billionaires' pockets. The ultra-rich fiddle as the world burns. Now joining us for a perspective from Russia is Boris Kargalitsky. He was deputy to the Moscow City Soviet between 1990 and 93, during which time he was a member of the executive of the Socialist Party of Russia. He was co-founder of the Party of Labor and advisor to the chairperson of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions of Russia. He has the distinction of having been thrown in jail by both the Soviet government and the Putin government. He's also the author of several books, including Empire of the Periphery, Russia and the World System, Russia under Yeltsin and Putin, Neoliberal Autocracy, and New Realism, New Barbarism, The Crisis of Capitalism. Currently, he's a professor at Moscow Higher School for Social and Economic Sciences, and he's editor of Rabkor, a daily Russian journal on YouTube and a channel of left-wing debate, and he joins us now from Moscow. Thanks for joining us again, Boris.
Thank you, Paul.
President Putin, the Russian leadership, the Russian oligarchy, they have to be aware of just how threatening this climate crisis is. I don't think they're not outright climate science deniers. They know what this is going to mean for the Russian economy and just the lives of people sooner than later. How does this factor into their analysis, both in a general way in terms of the invasion of Ukraine and obviously the need for global cooperation, which couldn't be further from?
Interestingly enough, I think, Paul, that Russian leaders are not climate change deniers, but they're climate change ignorers, in the sense that they do not consider that to be a serious problem.
I have to say that seems to be more or less the truth in the West too. But go ahead.
Yes, very much so. But of course, there were politicians like Donald Trump who presented some kind of vision based on not just ignoring but denying the threat. So far, no one in Russia publicly denied that there is a threat or that there is a problem. But at the same time, no one among Russian top politicians ever considered that to be anything serious. Well, and this is very interesting and tragic in a way because, well, as you already told, much of Russia's territory is in the permafrost zone, and much of Russian economy depends on it. And for example, I have been to Yakutia a few times, for example. I know this region not necessarily that well, but I love it. I really love it. It's a really exciting place, and it is really very interesting place with a lot of culture and a lot of social and even political activities and so on. Interestingly enough, it's considered to be one of the most democratic regions in Russian Federation. So far, they didn't have political prisoners. For example, almost every Russian region has its own political prisoners. Yakutia so far didn't have any. And that tells you much about this place. But anyhow, much of the territory of Yakutia is in permafrost zone, and they really feel global warming. Warning, it's a Freudian slip. They really feel global warming because you see the buildings are becoming unstable in the city. The buildings are not collapsing yet, but they're discussing what are they going to do if the temperature increases just a little bit more and a little bit further, and then there would be a very serious problem for the city of Yakutsk, for example. And there are plenty of other problems like that. So the answer of Russian elite is very simple. As long as we can continue to sell oil, the rest doesn't matter. That's a very simple and, in a certain sense, a very effective answer because, well, they consider that this will continue for another decade or so, and they do not care about anything which is going to happen in like 2 or 3 decades from now. It's not very humane to think like that, but that's the way they think. And well, theoretically, Putin is planning to stay in power till 2036. The basic idea is that till 2036, global warming is not going to become catastrophic for Russia, and after, it doesn't matter. That's the policy.
They're probably quite wrong about that because the latest IPCC prediction is a global warming could hit 1.5 by 2033, if not sooner. And if the overall trend of warming in Russia is in fact maybe 1.5 times faster, or at least significantly faster than the global warming, that means Russia could be hitting 1.5 sooner than anywhere else. And both the permafrost effects and such and heat waves and all the rest of the extreme weather could be hitting Russia actually worse and more quickly. But they, as you say, unlike, more or less like the elites everywhere, they figure, well, we'll keep at it while the going's good, and maybe there'll be some wonderful technology solution. Is Putin and the Russian government doing anything to use all the oil revenues to more diversify the economy? I saw a quote somewhere. Putin says they're going to wean Russia off oil and gas, but that doesn't seem to really be happening.
They keep speaking about that kind of saving the country from oil addiction for the 20 years of Putin in power, for the whole period of Putin staying in power. I remember them speaking about that about 2000. Now it's 2022. So this is a very, very popular kind of melody, but it never goes anywhere close to any practice. On the contrary, throughout these 20 years, when they kept speaking about oil addiction, which has to be overcome, it increased the dependency of Russian economy on oil and gas and fossil fuels and raw materials in general increased massively throughout the period of Putin's power. And actually now it's getting even worse because the oil economy is less hit by sanctions at this point. Though in the long run, it's going to be hit. In the long run, I think it's going to be hit very heavily. And to some extent, it's good news for Russia because it will speed up the process of change, which will not go from the top, of course. It is going to be very dramatic and maybe even catastrophic, but to some extent, it's kind of normal. History is not necessarily a nice road to go. It's very dramatic itself. You should not expect it to go so smoothly. So in that sense, there is a tremendous contradiction between the objective necessity to do certain things and the objective capacity of the ruling elites to do necessary things. I think, one problem is that to do the things which we have to do what is actually needed, we first have to get rid of these elites because they are the main obstacle. Their interests are vested and rooted in the current state of things, in the current system, in the current way things are done. And in that sense, you see, any serious attempt to change things is not possible because it means for them that they have to abolish themselves. They're not going to abolish themselves. They're going to, they want to stay in power. They want to keep living off oil revenues and so on and so on. But on the other hand, the irony of this current crisis and this current war is that in a very specific and very traumatic way, I think it's going to contribute to the global restructuring and to their technological change. In a certain sense, I think the general trend was already more or less formulated and more or less discovered by Western elites, in the sense that they do understand that certain changes are necessary, but there is a problem. The problem is who is going to pay the bills, who's going to pay for the process, and one thing which is absolutely clear for the elites in the West is that they do not want to pay. They're going to make someone else to pay for the transition. So unlike Russia, where they do not think the transition is possible or necessary, Western elites, which are somewhat more advanced, they are one step further in the sense that they do understand that something has to be done, but somebody else, not them, has to pay the costs of transition.
Well, that somebody else should be workers should pay. That's the somebody else. or poorer countries that they could try to squeeze something out of.
Exactly. Here I'm coming exactly to that point. Uh, uh, the others are either toiling masses of Western countries or some foreign countries which do not belong to the West, to the Western core. So these are two potential sponsors of the transition within their vision of transition. And the war, in a certain sense, is facilitating that kind of strategy. Because on the one hand, if you are speaking in terms of social division of costs, the social distribution of costs, then you can say, look, we're at war. We have to defend freedom and democracy and sovereignty of Ukraine, not just Ukraine, but Europe as a whole, and so on and so on and so on. And by the way, it's all true. It's all true. There is a threat posed by Putin and his entourage, his oligarchs. So, but it is a real threat, but it's also a great pretext to make masses pay. So the best pretexts are the ones which have some truth behind them. You see, if it is a total lie, if it is a total propaganda, it's very hard to convince people. But when there is something to it, when there is a serious element of truth within this discourse, it's much easier to sell that discourse to the public because you can point to the real facts, to the hard facts that prove that this discourse is not just taken out of the air.
So you're talking about NATO expansion and things like this.
Not only this, I think the very idea of redistribution of costs is part of the transition. Ordinary people are going to accept lower living standards, less consumption of energy, probably less consumption in general, lower wages, and some kind of new austerity. Let's put it, it will be not financial austerity, but it will be energy austerity. This kind of new austerity, which is not that much about having less money, but which is more about having less access to fuel, to energy, to heating, and so on and so on and so on. People have to stay a bit less warm, and it's not just about the companies, the big corporations failing or not being interested to pay their share of the costs of transition, but it will be about evil Russia. It will be about evil Putin, which doesn't change the fact that Putin's policies are really evil, you see? And in that sense, it's a very good use of the war to promote particular agenda, the agenda of, let's put it, fuel austerity, this kind of new austerity, and trying to retain as much as possible from the neoliberal order. I don't think that they will be able to sustain neoliberal order anyhow. It's collapsing, it's falling apart, and it's not sustainable within the new model of development. It's not compatible with the new emerging model, but they're going to sustain, to keep as much as possible from that model within the new one. And for that very reason, the war is a very good solution. And then speaking about countries, again, there are different countries. Poor countries are so poor, there is not much you can get out of them. And Western countries, yes, they are going to pay, but the toiling masses are going to pay. Then who is else the one who is going to pay? Russia will pay because, for example, they will cut oil trade. But if it were within the peaceful situation, there would be a big quarrel, a big debate. Who is going to cut that much? Who's going to cut less? Who's going to cut the oil interests more, and so on and so on? How to divide, how to distribute these cuts, these decreases of production or income between different groups within the oil economy. At this stage, the solution is discovered. Russia will pay the cost. They will cut Russian oil. They will cut Russian oil revenues to the minimal level possible. At the same time, Saudis and some others will probably retain their income, at least much of their income, and definitely increase their share of the market. So it's also a way to redistribute the markets, while at the same time, in the long run, diminishing their importance, diminishing their the dependency of economy or global economy on oil and fossil fuels in general. So the long-term trend is to diminish their role of fossil fuels, but the short-term aspect of it is to redistribute the market for fossil fuels simultaneously. So it's not just about cutting the market down, but it's also about redistributing shares within the market, which potentially is going to diminish. So in that sense, it's the situation which generates a lot of conflict anyhow. So in that sense, Russian-Ukrainian war is just a specific aspect of a global transition process. And in a certain sense, it is used by Western elites in a very competent and very strategic way. And this shows the difference between Russian oligarchy and Western oligarchs, because Western oligarchs are capable of thinking strategically, and they're capable of developing strategies, while Russian oligarchs behave kind of like animals, They react only to the immediate threats, only to the immediate factors, only to the immediate news, to the recent news. And that's why they're totally incapable of developing strategies, or they develop wrong strategies, like trying to get back into the world as it existed 200 years ago, or something like that, you see? Like, okay, turning their nostalgia for the old Russian Empire into a kind of quasi-strategy, which is totally disconnected from reality. And that's why Russian oligarchy is exactly the one who is going to suffer. And honestly, I don't have any pity for them. I'm not sorry for them. I don't think there is any reason for us to be unhappy about Russian oligarchs paying part of the price. But unfortunately, Russian toiling masses are also going to pay the price. And this is a much more serious question. And the question is whether Russians are going to accept that kind of transition, and whether the Russians are going to accept the role of passive victims of what's going on. We'll see, because Russian society, as I told you before, is very apathetic and atomized and apolitical, but maybe things will change.
I think you might be overestimating the Western oligarchs' ability to have any kind of strategy here, other than a strategy of what you were saying earlier, ignoring, but not being outright climate deniers. But the strategy right now seems to be confrontation with China, and we're looking, not just is that strategy coming from the section of the elites that are behind the Biden administration, but the far right, which may well take control of Congress in 2022, in the next election in 2024, take the presidency. You may have the far right in control of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the White House. And the far right around Trump, much of which is Christian nationalist, their enemy number one actually isn't Putin and Russia, it's China. And in fact, there could be, if they had their way, there would be an alliance with Putin and Russia. But current American policy has actually pushed Russia closer to China. But these Christian nationalists, Putin's kind of a hero to them. So it's kind of unpredictable how this might go if, in fact, they do get control of the White House and thus the armed forces. is in terms of the Russian positioning in this, cannot China make up for whatever they lose from the West in terms of oil revenues? So, and maybe, maybe they don't have to pay. Maybe they just have to become a satellite state of China.
No, no. Well, of course, Russian elite probably can accept the role of a satellite state for China, but Chinese are not very interested. Chinese are really not interested in taking care of Russia's problems. For example, now Russia is trying to sell oil, which it fails to sell to the West, to China. Chinese say, okay, that's a very good idea, but we need you to accept a discount up to 40%. In that sense, it's very interesting that China behaves towards Russia these days very much the same ways as Russia used to behave towards China in the 19th century. It's a kind of irony of history. Chinese are approaching very brutal neo-colonial line towards Russia. They're practicing this kind of neo-colonial brutal exploitation of Russian resources, and it is so brutal and so aggressive that even Russian oligarchs are really scared, because if it continues like that, they're going to become broke. They'll be broke. They'll be out of business and so on. Because China is insistent for years that they're not going to negotiate. They're not going to negotiate. They're just going to take whatever can be taken. That's it. That's about it. And by the way, also the interesting thing is that when China, I've been to Siberia quite a few times. I love Siberia. I go there very often. When there is Chinese business coming, it's a disaster. They just take away everything, and they don't build any infrastructure. They don't fix anything. They just take away anything they can and go away. You see, that's the way they use the resources in Russia. And in that sense, also Russian society is becoming very anti-Chinese, and not in the xenophobic, not in the xenophobic sense, not that Russian people are against Chinese people, but they're very much against Chinese business and Chinese politicians and so on. They're considered to be a very serious threat, including some crazy things, because sometimes, for example, in Irkutsk, where they have this lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in the world, as you know, which has the largest quantity of water in the world in one place. So in Irkutsk, everybody is afraid of Chinese stealing the water from Baikal, which probably is not exactly true, but then they say, okay, they will just bottle all this water and take it away and drink it. And there is 1.4 billion Chinese, so it's just enough to drink out the whole lake. And of course, this is not serious. Of course, you understand. It's more like a kind of phobia, but that just gives you the idea of how Russians feel about Chinese business coming.
So what do we do? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And finishing, and technologically, interestingly enough, China is not really interested or capable or ready to share anything with Russia at this point. So in that sense, again, Chinese officials, Chinese bureaucracy and capitalists, they're looking at Russia's trouble with some kind of satisfaction, I should say. They probably want these troubles to become deeper. Then at some point, maybe they will move in the position of strength, so to speak, and maybe not just help out, but kind of intervene to get as much as possible out of this trouble.
So the neocons, and so more classical neocons, a la the Republicans that were around the Bush administration, many of them have more or less either actual people or in terms of the way they look at the world, taken over much of Biden foreign policy. What's on the horizon is Trumpian, with or without Trump, which will be not led by the classical neocons, but much with the same perspective of the need for American global dominance, but with more passion or hatred for China and wanting to take the Taiwan situation perhaps even up to the acknowledgement of independence for Taiwan, which would spark, in all likelihood, war. The Russians, as you say, you've described the Putin government and the Russian oligarchy. I mean, there's not a lot of hope in this situation, and it's perhaps more globally dangerous than ever in the history of the world, of course, because of climate and also because of the nuclear threat. So what are we peoples to do?
I am not pessimistic, honestly. I think that the night is darkest, as you know, before the dawn. And I think we are going to face the period of turmoil. But the problem for the elites is that their policies are inconsistent with the reality. You see, they're inconsistent with the objective needs of development and the objective process which is taking place in the nature of the planet. So, in that sense, I still do believe that that objective forces of nature and history and social development, they are getting their kind of business done in one way or another. And I think once we get into deeper into these troubles, for example, in case of Russia, it's very clear that the existing structures of state, if and when we are going to face serious military failures and defeats in this Ukrainian war, are going to start decomposing somehow. And people will become repoliticized. They will have to become repoliticized. The troubles we are facing ahead will make people act, even though they're very apathetical, apolitical, and so on, but people will have to act. And more importantly, they will have to organize. They will have to self-organize because there is no other way to solve. There is no other way to solve the problems. And well, I think the agenda for the left is very clear. This is kind of eco-sociological. The agenda for the left is very clear. It's eco-socialist and democratic planning, which is absolutely necessary. And it's very easy to explain this agenda to people. For example, coming back to Siberia and Yakutia, enormous forest fires took place a year ago. Enormous, terrible forest fires, the worst since 1912. So in 1912, there were terrible forest fires in Siberia, and also they continued during the first years of the First World War, by the way, which is also a very telling association with the past. And well, then what Soviet Union did, Soviet Union reforested Russia massively. There was a huge problem. There was a huge project, a huge program of reforestation of Russia, which was realized in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and up to 1930s, late 1930s, for example, and actually did work quite considerably. Why did it work? Because there was planning, there was a serious effort to do things in a complex way, so that combine social, economic, financial, and so on elements within one particular effort to achieve particular goals. And for example, now we need the same thing to be done again. It's not possible to do through the market. And it's not that I'm saying that we need to go back to Stalinist kind of centralized bureaucratic planning and autocratic political regime. What I'm saying is that some kind of coordinated planning is necessary. Environmental activities should be combined with economic development and social development. These things have to be done together. And the important thing, you have to expropriate the oligarchs. There are resources. There are plenty of resources available. These resources are just in the wrong hands. These resources are in the hands of the people who do not want things to move. They want things to stay exactly they are now. So there must be some kind of global effort to expropriate global oligarchy and to establish global environmental planning combined with social development.
Well, there's no doubt we need it, but we're far from it in terms of movements organized and capable of doing that. So something's going to have to happen at the elite level to at least mitigate what's coming. I'm not all that optimistic, but there needs to be something, because there's no way the global oligarchs are getting expropriated before 2050. And by 2050, we're into past 2 degrees and we're on our way to 3 and 4. And
Paul, I disagree. I disagree. We have to fight to make it happen much faster.
I'm all for fighting it, but
We will fight. I assure you that the political crisis in Russia will fuel a lot of political fire around the world, and it's going to come.
well, there needs to be a breakthrough somewhere, and if it's Russia, would be great. But that said, let me just say that one thing that will at least facilitate the situation will be an end to the war in Ukraine, because as long as that continues, it fires the worst instincts and nature of the West and of Russia. So is there any prospect for that actually happening? I think I said in the last interview, in Western TV coverage, there's a lot of talk about how the sanctions against Russia are actually hurting Europe and the United States. There's a lot of talk that inflation is going to help elect the Republicans, and a lot of that inflation is coming because of the war. Maybe there's an appetite on at least sections of the Western elites who don't want to use this just to crush Russia, but actually might see the necessity for some kind of agreement. Is there a growing appetite for a deal in Russia? I'm not sure there is in Ukraine itself, but.
Well, first of all, why should Ukraine make a deal with the Russian aggressors? Let me be very clear. Russian army invaded Ukraine. It's taken over its territory. It's shelling Ukrainian cities. It's killing Ukrainian citizens en masse. It's killing thousands of civilians. It is robbing Ukrainian production, because what we see now is that Russian military are forced. It's not the idea of it's not the function of the military, but they are forced to help moving grain resources out of Ukraine in the occupied territories, or moving out steel, which is stocked in Mariupol, and so on and so on, which military actually hate doing because they're not robbers, they're fighters. So there is a lot of discontent among the military about that kind of use of their force. And I think the military are not very happy with the war anymore, at least. Not anymore, at least. But I don't see Putin compromising with Ukraine or with the West, unless he is allowed to continue robbing Ukraine and destroying Ukraine. So the very purpose of Putin's policy at this point is not to conquer Ukraine. There is no way they're going to do it. The policy is about wrecking Ukraine. By the way, they learned that from Americans. This is very much like Americans who kind of addressed the problem of Iraq, for example. It was not so much about taking it over. It was not about rebuilding Iraq or Afghanistan. It was about wrecking Iraq and Afghanistan. This is exactly what Russia is doing these days towards Ukraine. In the Russian government, not Russian people, of course. Russian government is doing that, and in the most brutal way. And there is no way it can be stopped unless Russian troops are evacuated from Ukrainian soil.
But that's not going to happen. I mean, you asked the question: why should the Ukrainians make a deal? They should make a deal to save lives.
Paul, there is no other way except Ukrainian army kicking Russian aggressors out of Ukraine, which is happening right now. These days, just in real time. These days, in real time, it is happening. Ukrainian army is winning the war in real time right now, day after day after day. And this is exactly what Russian military know. This is why Russian military are exactly against the war, and Russian military are very eager to stop the war and evacuate as soon as possible, but they're not allowed to do that by the political leaders, because evacuating Ukraine and accepting the fact that Russia is defeated militarily means the end of Putin. It means that Putin is finished within maybe not days or months, but within maybe half a year or so. He's going to be ended.
Now, why do you think that's the case on the ground? Because, I mean, I have no idea what's going on the ground, but I am hearing from, through Western and other sources that the Russians are actually doing increasingly better as time goes on. That's the way it's being talked about here.
It's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Well, of course, if you speak to Russian independent military experts, including those like Strelkov, who are very nationalist, but very close to the actual military on the ground, what they report is a disaster. They report the army falling apart, very much situation of 1916, right before Russian Revolution. Command and control structures are disintegrating. The artillery doesn't have enough shells, enough firepower, enough ammunition to fight. HIMARSs, American multi-rocket launching systems, as far as I remember at the time the name. HIMARSs are inflicting enormous damage. And just one thing which is happening, why I'm saying it's happening in real time right now. For 2 days, Antonov Bridge is shelled by Ukrainian troops. Antonov Bridge is the major connection between Russian troops on the left bank of Dnieper and Russian troops on the right bank of Dnieper, of the river, which means that if Antonov Bridge fails to function, the whole Russian army, which is around Kherson, is going to stay without ammunition, fuel, food, and so on and so on. It's a whole army. It's one of the major Russian forces or the Russian armies on the ground. If they fail to reestablish connection through Antonov Bridge, the choice they have now is either to leave Kherson, which is the major acquisition Russian army ever made during this war, which also means that it is like recognizing the war is lost, because that's the major conquest which they're going to evacuate, or they're going to stay over, which will probably be the order of Putin, which means there's going to be another Stalingrad. You'll have this whole army with ammunition, without ammunition, fuel, and food. This is exactly why Russian military are very unhappy with the military leadership. I mean, the top military leadership like Shoigu and others, they're not even professional military. They're career politicians in epaulets in the uniforms.
Well, let me ask, then does this lead towards a negotiated settlement, or does it lead toward a more desperate form of attack? Meaning, perhaps, do they even get serious about tactical nuclear weapons?
Putin may probably be interested in tactical nuclear weapons, but military will probably not allow him to get even close to that. I think the big question is whether we are going to have some kind of coup d'etat or there will be some other solution. We don't know, but definitely they have to solve the problem. They have to solve the problem. The problem is they have to get rid of Putin. They have to get somebody to blame for everything, leave Ukraine, try to make a deal with the West, and try exactly to somehow to continue Putinism without Putin, neoliberalism without the most compromised personnel. As I spoke about Western neoliberals, they, as far as I understand, they're trying to move into a new model of development, but trying to retain as much as possible from the previous model within the new one. And I think this is exactly what Russian elite wants to do. They want to get rid of Putin, that's for sure, because they know that Putin is extremely toxic. Putin is irrelevant and inadequate. They have to get rid of him, but getting rid of him is difficult, not only because there is a system which is based on securing his power through political police and so on and so on, which is not the major problem. The major problem is that they are afraid of destabilizing the system too much. So you get rid of Putin, okay, but what are you going to do with the rest of the system, you see? So in that sense, the power of dictators, contrary to what many people think, is not with the political police, with the security agencies and so on. The power of the people is very much with the part of the bourgeoisie which actually is not happy with it, you see? So in that sense, they know that getting rid of the top person is really dangerous, because that it's like opening a Pandora box. You do that and you solve a minor problem, and well, they know the history of Russian Revolution. They know the history of Russian Revolution, but somehow they have to solve the problem. I think they will find the way to solve the problem. Most probably, right now when we are talking, there are some other people talking about these problems within Rublovka, which is kind of Russian most kind of wealthy, most rich neighborhood, like I don't know what's the equivalent in the United States, but we know it's the neighborhood for the billionaires and multi-billionaires. So I think this is while we are talking now, most probably these people are just sitting there drinking vodka and discussing how to solve the problem. Whether they will solve the problem or not, I don't know, but they are going to solve it somehow. But also, I'm sure that this is basically what military commanders of the medium and also some of the high-ranking guys in the military are talking about also right now in Kherson and maybe even in Moscow. So they have to do something, and they don't know what to do. And this is exactly the dead end for the regime and for the system. And this is also good and bad. It's bad in the sense that, as we told, this is like with the climate crisis story. You see, something has to be done, but it's not going to get done unless somebody has to be abolished. Somebody at the very top has to be abolished, and abolishing some people at the very top, it's only the beginning of a much more serious and much more dramatic and dangerous process.
What's the mood of the Russian people?
There is no mood. There's no mood. Russian people are just, I published a few texts about that. Also, look at, we have this English language, subscription service, Russian Descent. done by Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi is at Substack. He kind of sends to subscribers some of the Russian texts in which also Russian left-wing sociologists and activists discuss these problems. And you see, Russian society, as I told you, it's very depressed. It's very depressed. People are just watching what's happening there, sometimes surprised and shocked by what's happening. They don't know what to do, and they're waiting for something to happen to change the situation. So military may move in with some initiative politically. Well, ironically, some of the security people who are very unhappy can also move in. But I can hardly imagine at this stage some kind of mass protest. Maybe later this autumn, maybe later when the situation gets worse, but not right now.
If I were Ukrainian, I wouldn't fight for one day to quote unquote liberate Donbass or Crimea. It's not worth thousands of Ukrainian lives so that Ukrainian oligarchs can control these territories. If somehow out of the situation you could have a real people's uprising and actually overthrow the Ukrainian oligarchs in the process of this, that's another matter, but that doesn't seem what's happening.
The tragedy of the situation is, of course, that Ukrainian oligarchs are no better than Russian oligarchs. There is no doubt about it. But we should not forget who is now the aggressive side. And it's not about Donbass and Crimea, by the way. Even the Ukrainian government at this stage is not demanding Crimea and Donbass to be taken back into Ukraine. What they're demanding is that Russian army should return back to its position, which it had taken on February 23rd, before the actual outburst of the big war, which is probably what most Ukrainian people would agree with as well. But you should not forget the impact of mass destruction, which was inflicted by Russian military on the Ukrainian people, because there were thousands of people who died in Mariupol. There were thousands of people who died elsewhere. Civilian casualties are quite impressive and terrible. And of course, that fuels not only anti-Russian sentiment, but also the ability of the Ukrainian troops to fight back. But the most interesting thing here is that most people who fight on the Ukrainian side are Russian speakers, and they're actually Russians. So it is very interesting that now most of the Ukrainian military who are fighting the war are Russian speakers and Russians, including generals, including top generals, and who are increasingly capable of speaking out against Ukrainian nationalism. So I do not exclude that the outcome on the Ukrainian side would also be that the power would be taken over by the militaries or by some of the proxies, like the ones of the politicians who are proxies for the military, political proxies of the military, people like Alexei Arestovich, for example, which I love to quote because he is the one who is becoming extremely popular both in Ukraine and in Russia, speaking.
Yeah, you talked about him in our last segment. Yeah,
speaking up very clearly and very radically against Ukrainian nationalism, and a few others who are trying to promote the same agenda. So interestingly, I think that possibly in Ukraine, if the military take over, it's not necessarily going to be a bad thing. It can be a good thing for Ukraine. In Russia, we cannot envisage military taking over politically. They may play a role in political change, but they're not going to take over politically because the structure of Russian and Ukrainian military is very different. And the culture is very different these days. Though historically they're coming from the same root, but they developed in a very different way. But again, I think that contrary to what many people think, those who want the war are not the military. Those who want the war to continue are politicians who force military to keep fighting. This is something you have to understand. And unless Russia is changing politically, there is no way we can get out of it.
Well, do you see the possibility of Russia agreeing to more or less go back to February 23rd?
Oh, it's very easy. There is just one person at this point who will not agree, which is Vladimir Putin. I think everybody else, even within the oligarchy, is ready to compromise. But they have to get rid of Putin, and it's not so easy, as I told you before, because it's not only about the security apparatus of Putin, which is protecting him physically, but it's very much their own fear of getting things out of control.
All right, well, let's continue this again soon. Thanks very much, Boris.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. And please don't forget all the donate and subscribe and all the buttons.